1. Panel, ladies and gentlemen, the irony of democracy is that the lower the bar you have, or the absence of a standard, the more it loses value and the more that people take it for granted. We don't think democracy in and of itself is an absolute thing, and in order to protect and preserve it, in order to make sure that it functions, and in order to make sure that you cater to the very needs of the people who voted you in power, who expect you to be competent and do the right thing, we need a certain sense of skepticism to serve as a check and balance, to be able to create that standard and be able to hold our politicians, those who are running and those who want to run, at a higher particular standard. Ladies and gentlemen, there have been presidents in the past who have had no education degree, the likes of Joseph Estrada, the likes of BBM, and for obvious reasons that, if you didn't know, one of them was actually convicted of plunder, and to a large extent, both of them are actually accused, and there's a lot of proof of them being incompetent for obvious reasons, ultimately sets a dangerous precedent for the political landscape in the Philippines. This debate is not about democracy being good or bad. This debate is not about education in itself being good or bad, or whether people have the right to be able to vote or not. But uniquely, this debate is about specifically the creation and upholding of a standard which we think is a bare minimum, which we think serves as the lens in which people look at their politicians when these people have a stigma or not. A couple of features of our model. Number 1, this is a regrets motion and it's a retrospective historical accounting of what exactly has happened in terms of the stigmatization. And we tell you on side opposition, we do not regret the stigmatization, and we think that absent stigmatization, it would be worse off for the Philippine political landscape, because whether it be from the top, like the president and their cabinet that they elect, all the way up down to the sangguniang kabataan, the barangay captains and mayors, we think uniquely the stigmatization in and of itself creates an incentive structure for education to be so proliferated and so important. With the rise of powers of DepEd and SHED, who from all parts of the Philippines are able to manage things like state universities and colleges, all sorts of provincial centers, and the advent of things like scholarships and grants, if you were to gut check this, Filipinos value what? They value education. And that's exactly because of what the stigmatization absent that has, especially in the political arena. Meaning, if you're a young child or a young indigenous minority individual who has the aspiration of being that party list leader, that senator, that congressperson, or heck, dreaming big and even being a president, you start aspiring for an education. But the cool part about this idea is that even if you don't win, even if you don't go into politics, even if you fail, it on average sets you up to be able to be better later on, because absent that, just like how the real world works, you probably won't be able to get a decent job as a white-collar supervisor or manager absent having a degree. Is that unfair? Absolutely. We think the world is unfair, and the standard in terms of looking at it exactly has to be reinforced, especially among the political arena, because the Philippines isn't just a corporation, it's more important than that. The second idea I have is, what is stigmatization really? A couple of things, right? We think that stigmatization in and of itself means the creation of the standard I talked about, and we think it's not necessarily about the policy, because it's not a this house would in terms of the legal ramifications. B, we think stigmatization means not voting and just less direct support of these individuals, meaning all things equal, candidate A and B, if one of them has an educational degree, we're probably going to vote or support them as opposed to the one who hasn't. And lastly, just overall campaign support and funding and optics for those individuals. The trade-off we're willing to make is particularly simple. To one extent, this is going to be exclusionary, but we think, like I said in my pre-oration, this in and of itself is not an absolute good, and we need the creation of the standard in order to serve as a check and balance against incompetence and malevolence, which we think plague particular individuals, especially those among political dynasties. What is my first argument, as I've also technically been arguing in my setup? The argument is that, why is the stigmatization of a non-degree holder particularly good, and how does this improve the overall political landscape? Responses to the previous speaker will be included. First thing I have to say is that this in and of itself creates the ultimate litmus test for that particular individual. Meaning, if they don't have the means, motivation, or capacity, because getting an education is difficult or hassle, even if I already mapped out how, to some extent, you have the proliferation of grants and scholarships, with will comes a way. Pag gusto may paraan, pag ayaw may dahilan. Meaning, if you really want to be that senator, that congressperson, that mayor, that barangay captain of your dreams, you're going to put the proof of work in to be able to try and strive for that. Absent that, then we question, what rigor do you have to be able to influence and lead if you can't even help yourself and do that, which, like I also mentioned, on average sets you up better. Secondly, we think that it just pushes better campaigning, and this is a direct response to the populist push of the previous speaker. Because absent a check and balance or a sense of skepticism, which exists only when you have the stigmatization, you leave it up to bogeyman vague metrics, like them being guapo, them being funny, them dancing budots in a particularly fun way. Case in point, all of the things that we see in status quo, wherein people who are comedians, those who are incompetent, are actually getting these particular slots, and we think that the lack of focus on their ability to get a proper education in and of itself opens the can of worms to all these vague things that people have. Meaning, the burden push on their side is a question on their counterfactual and comparative. Meaning, absent this particular stigmatization, what are you going to do? And the previous speaker, in and of themselves, proves that in status quo, people vote these particular individuals and as a consequence aren't able to have some sort of vetting process or mechanism in terms of that. Ultimately, ladies and gentlemen, we think that it's good for the individual to truly test themselves and put their money where their mouth is when they have a proof of work of their education, and ultimately better off for the average Filipino voter and individual who becomes subject to what they do at the point in which they get into power. And we think that education and being skeptical about the lack thereof puts them in a better place. We are very proud to stand on side negative.